May the solstice and turning of the wheel bring you love, peace, and good fortune in the coming year.
Separate fact from fiction.
Rediscover your true self and be the happy frog you came here to be. For that, you have to remove the social self, the programmed on to you self. This public self that has become too big. You have to peel away that public self in order to get back to your private, true self. Some people have eradicated their true self to a degree they no longer are aware of its existence. It's completely subconscious, swept under the rug, ignored and forgotten. And it takes a huge effort to go back to that true self. Remove all that programming.
I say all families are dysfunctional to some degree. And then the logicians say, wait a minute, well, if all are dysfunctional, then there's no exceptions. And I studied pharmalogic for a number of years, and I don't care about logic. I believe that it's possible for all the birds to be flying in the wrong direction. That's possible, at least. And Snell and Gail Putney wrote a beautiful book years ago called The Adjusted American, Normal Neuroses in American Society. That the rules that we have been using, which worked 150, 200 years ago, they worked when society was dominator, when it was male-dominated, when people were into survival, when the beating of women and children was commonplace. The rule of thumb was how big your rod could be to beat your children with, to beat your wife with. We forget how primitive human life has been in some ways. Lloyd Demuth is writing these histories of childhood now, accurate histories of childhood. And what we're understanding is that childhood was a nightmare, that incest was commonplace, that children were considered to be little animals up till about age 7. That was the age of reason. So you whip them and beat them and spank them, and that's the way you get little animals to be trained properly. I remember hearing a woman say she had broken her son's spirit by the time he was 3 years old. This guy was this apathetic, passive-aggressive, alcoholic, who'd had all the life beaten out of him, literally. So we're really beginning to understand that these rules reached their apex at Nuremberg. The inherent potential of a set of rules that said one person has power over other people, one person's the master, the rest are the slave, deny and repress emotions, sexually shame people. These are what these rules were that we've inherited. They reached their apex at Nuremberg. Obedience without content. Those Nazi murderers stood up and blushed when they missed the instruction to stand up, but they didn't blush when they read these lists of all the people they had killed. So obedience without content. So I believe that everybody's carrying what I call the spiritual wound. And the spiritual wound is that everybody needs to be loved for the very one they are. You need to be loved for the very one you are. There's nobody like you. There never has been anyone like you. There never will be anyone like you again. So we need to be loved for the very one we are. When we're not loved for our I am who I am, we're spiritually wounded. When Moses went to the bush, he said, "What's your name?" In the theophany of the burning bush, God said, "I am who I am." Every human being needs to be I am who I am. The second I tell you, what are you laughing about? There's nothing to laugh about. What are you crying about? There's nothing to cry about. Don't you ever raise your voice to me again. Don't you ever quit being such a ninny. I remember going downstairs one night and saying I was lonely, and they said, "You're not." "No, you're not." I went back up to my room, scratching my little head, going, "God, I must be weird. I could have sworn I was lonely." If you don't understand the context, the family system from which you came, you simply cannot understand how you're carrying that system right now and how you can be living out somebody else's life rather than your own. And that, to me, is very scary, to have gone, to go to your death and never know what your one and only life was. And this mobile is a work of art. It is highly balanced. And for this series, I asked her to make something that would represent the systemic balance and unity of a work of art, but I'm using it also to symbolize the systemic notion of the family. That the family is a system. And that's what we've really come to understand. That it's a system, and as a system, it has its own systemic needs. It has its own systemic needs. That the persons in this system the system is not really the sum total of 5 individual parts or 7 individual parts. The system is the interrelationship of all the parts, such that if I touch that part, every other part in this system is affected by the touching of that one part. So the whole notion of a family as a system is that a family is composed of interdependent parts. That is, every part is affecting every other part. Now let me say something very quickly. What that means right off the bat is that we've got to move out of an old linear kind of thinking, such as we would blame all the family problems on the fact that Daddy was an alcoholic. It becomes a cause-effect blame game. See, my father indeed was an alcoholic, but so was his mother and so was her father. So who are we going to blame it on? And I don't know. I don't know any data 3 or 4 generations back, but I got some big hunches that this has been going on for a long time. And that basically it's not a blame game. It's to begin to understand, first of all, how, let's say if this represented my father, how my father comes out of a system himself in which he was impacted by that system. For example, my father's mother was alcoholic and she divorced his father who abandoned him. And he had 2 stepfathers, both of whom were alcoholics, one of whom was violent and tried to kill him on several occasions. Happy memoirs back there, okay? So by the time my daddy marries my mother, he's already carrying a couple of generations of dysfunctionality. See, again, remember, dysfunctionality means you're missing the mark. Not all the parts are functioning. Why is my daddy an alcoholic? Because, like all compulsive disorders, it's a cover-up for his feelings. A compulsion or an addiction is a pathogenic relationship with a mood-altering event, experience, or thing that has harmful, life-damaging consequences. It's real easy to understand addiction to alcohol or cocaine or sex or Bluebell cookies and cream ice cream, because those things are highly euphoric and mood-altering. It's not easy to understand how vacuum cleaning can be an addiction. Or workaholic. How does a workaholic mood alter? He doesn't mood alter in the same way that an alcoholic does. What he does is he distracts himself from his feelings by working all the time. Do you understand how that's mood altering? Okay, so my father is carrying dysfunction. What's the dysfunction? He doesn't have his feelings available to him. The only time my daddy can feel his feelings is when he's drunk. Okay? When he drinks, he can feel his feelings. He becomes spontaneous. He can be sad. He can be angry. He can be vitalized. Because very early on, he, in relationship to the system that he came out of, became dysfunctional. that dysfunction takes place in the system, everything in the system is stressed. Just like when I push that, every part of it is moved. Here is my mother, here is my sister, here am I, here's my brother. Every single one of us are affected by that stress. See, because what does stress do? Every organism is geared to handle a little stress. We all have the ability to handle stress so that we can, when the stress comes, you go into a fight-flight response and the heart beats faster and the blood comes out of the lower intestines, goes into the legs, into the brain, so you can fight or run. But what no one was ever intended to do was to live like that chronically. To live like that all the time. So what happens in this system is if this stressor remains, then chronic stress takes over and everybody in that system have to adapt to that stress. Now, do you see immediately how nobody else in that system can have their own reality? No one else in the system can have their own reality because the stress is too great. You're in survival all the time. What happened to a person like that? Very early on, they got cut off from their feelings. Very early on, they got abused in some way so that they were not allowed to be who they were. If you look at this little chart over here, this is a chart that really depicts a theme that I'm going to be coming back to all through this series. That if you think of this bottom block as you or me at birth, this is what we look like at birth. There's a private self and a public self. That is, there's a part that I experience of me under my skin, then there's a part of me that you experience. Or another way to say this is that this is the conforming self, the public self, and this is the actualizing self. This is the part of me that is individualized, this private self, and this is the part of me that conforms for socialization, if you will, or to survive. Now, by puberty, if you come out of what I'm going to consider normal kind of sex role scripting, see, which is already abusive. If you just come out of normalcy in our culture, although we're making changes and we're trying to become conscious of this, but you see a little girl is born, here's her private self, suddenly she laughs too loud and somebody says, don't act like that. You stop gurgling when you laugh, that's not ladylike. So this private self goes in and this public self gets bigger as she pretends not to gurgle when she laughs in order to please mother or please daddy or please whoever. So constantly she's sacrificing her real self to this public self. She has to give up who she is to fit the script that the culture decided on is what makes a real woman. And it may not be like her at all. It may be an act that she has to play in order to adapt to survive. Okay? By puberty, look at how big the public self is as opposed to the private self. And let's say by midlife, that private self is just a tiny little part of you. That most of you or most of us or whoever it is an act, is a performance. Or as somebody said, by this point you've become a human doing and not a human being. That your whole life is a performance and an act. It's an achievement. See, very early on you go to school and you get grades and you achieve. And they measure you and they judge you. And if you don't meet the measurement of the judgment, that private self, which may be very different, which may be, you may hear a different drummer. There's never been another you. Who are we going to measure you by? See, what I want you to get right now, there's no such thing as normal. Because if somebody's normal, they're the norm. We got to compare everybody to them. If you step forward and say, I am a normal person, then every one of us have to be compared to you. That you are the measure and the standard by which all of us are measured. What I'd rather say is we miss the mark. The sorrow of not being a saint is that you're not functional. Is that by the time you get here, you're pretending like you're not angry when you're angry because that's dirty or that's not ladylike. Or you're pretending not to be sad when you're sad because that's not manly. And so part of you is frozen and split off and gone part of you is no longer functional. Your feelings. Or maybe way back here you were so, you had such an authoritarian family struggle, you were never allowed to think a thought. If you said something, someone would say, that's stupid, or that's crazy, or where did you get a crazy idea like that? So what you learned to do was to adapt. You pretended like you didn't have any idea, and pretty soon, by the time you got to here, you quit thinking. You see, if you never were allowed to have a will of your own, how could you have any willpower? How could you have any will to decide anything for yourself?
And what it really requires for us to break free of them. Because the nature of what Dr. Ramani and other psychologists call the trauma bond is that we can become imprisoned by that bond. And it can be extraordinarily difficult to break free from it and to finally release ourselves from a relationship like that. And we should say that a relationship like that is tremendously detrimental to our mental health, our well-being, our self-esteem, our quality of life. It is a situation that is maddening. It slowly erodes your confidence in yourself, especially if your needs are ignored, if you are gaslit over things that you would like to happen and told that it's crazy for you to want those things, or you're high maintenance for wanting those things, or that when someone tries to convince you that your version of reality is completely false, it can have the effect of you not knowing which way is up anymore. You stop trusting yourself. And of course, when you're with someone who constantly breaks their promises to you, constantly lies to you, and then if you catch them in the lie, makes it your fault somehow.
I think a lot of this is because many people with NPD and in the cluster B spectrum rely on a sort of fake stupidity as a tactic for getting themselves out of trouble. They simply pretend not to understand basic morality, basic cultural mores, basic societal norms, so that they can shrug their shoulders and say, yes, you did catch me doing the terrible thing, but I didn't even know that that was wrong. The second favorite game the narcissist loves to play, deflect and attack. Attacking the attacker, attacking the person who's caught them out, who's brought something that they've done to their attention, perhaps even has evidence of a wrongdoing. This is a good way for the narcissist to put the focus back on the person who's brought that evidence to them. It's to deflect it and to attack the attacker, the person who is attacking them. This tactic is also known as whataboutism. This was a tactic that was developed, it's largely thought, in Soviet Russia, where any criticism of the Soviet regime would be met with the response, but what did you do? What did you do? What have you done out in the world? You're not so perfect. And there's a finger pointing back the other way.
It's actually a sign of self-love that we feel healthy guilt. But what about the other side of guilt? What about unhealthy guilt? What is unhealthy guilt? Well, for starters, unhealthy guilt, or maybe fake guilt is another way to put it, is when we feel guilty for things that we actually shouldn't feel guilty for. When we actually feel guilty for our healthy behavior. When we feel bad for things that we've done that are good. When we tell the truth and it threatens other people and we feel bad about it. We want to undo the healthy things that we do. Where does this start? This starts in childhood. It starts when we have parents or other authority figures over us who can't hear the truth, who don't want to hear the truth, who are blocked, who don't want to look at reality, and who are threatened when we naturally and spontaneously as children are honest and tell the truth. It overwhelms them. Also, when we set boundaries with people who want to violate us, when we say, no, you can't violate us, and when we fight for our right to be self-healing, self-protecting, when we say, no, you can't intrude into our personal space emotionally or physically, you can't hurt me, and the people around us the people who we need to love us, the authority figures in our lives who have control over our lives, when they feel bad, but they can't acknowledge it themselves. Basically, we take on the guilt that they should be feeling, but it's twisted because we feel guilty for causing them the pain that they should be feeling. We feel guilty for waking them up to feeling the guilt that they should feel. When we take on this unhealthy sense of guilt because they can't acknowledge the healthy guilt that they have. They can't acknowledge the bad things that they are doing, the bad things that they have done, the bad things that were done to them. Basically, when their healing processes are so impeded, so thwarted, that they can't move forward. So what happens is when they have power over other people, they force the other people to also become unhealthy. They force the other people in their lives to play their unhealthy game. They force the other people in their lives to share the same denial that they have. And part of what they do is they take their guilt and they project it. They project it onto you. They project it onto me. And what happens as little children, and this is so common, is that we feel guilty for things that we should never feel guilty for. We feel responsible for problems that we never caused, or we feel responsible to solve problems that are totally beyond our control. We feel bad that the people around us feel bad. We feel bad for telling the truth and that it wakes other people up and causes them to feel the pain that they need to feel in order to grow. And they can get very, very angry at us. They can blame us. They can say, "You're making me feel bad. How dare you criticize me?" Well, maybe the criticisms that we have of other people are actually really quite appropriate. Maybe some of the things that we're saying to these people actually are really healthy and very natural. Maybe when somebody hits us and we say, "Don't hit us. What's wrong with you for hitting me?" The other person says, "Oh my God, something is wrong with me." And they feel really bad. They feel guilty, but they can't accept it. They can't own it. They can't sit with, "Oh my God, there's something wrong or something pathological with me." So they say, "How dare you stop me?" And they get angry and they make you feel bad for it. And so what it ends up with is a pattern of people in their lives accepting guilty feelings from other people that they shouldn't have, and living with a sense of feeling guilty, perhaps even for their own existence, and living their lives trying to make other people happy, feeling guilty that they're not making other people happy. I think one of the most common ways that this plays out, and I see this all the time, is people, adults, not having their own independent lives, not growing, not healing, not having healthy relationships, not having their own sense of independence.
So yes, fuck guilt. This is a powerful emotion that keeps many of us confined to others' scripts. And this is one of the primary tools that pendulums and other people will use to keep you going along with a script that you did not write or what was intended for you. So, and if you don't do it or see it the same way, then there's a guilt process that occurs. And this is really just a number one tactic of manipulating you psychologically to keep you to adhering to that script. Live in accordance with your beliefs and you will have no guilt. No one would dare to condemn you if you do not, in fact, feel guilty. If you previously had a habit to apologize for this and that, now create another habit. Explain your action only if this is actually necessary. No need to convince yourself that you are not obliged to anyone for anything. Let your sense of duty remain, but externally, you should not display it. Guilt is kind of the first thing that someone will use from a person-to-person sort of negotiation, in a person-to-person negotiation. Guilt is one of the tools to make the other person try to feel bad about not adhering to the script that the person trying to pull guilt from the other person has created. So guilt is sort of a rally to get you to continue to conform to the script of another person.
Making you feel like this. Maybe this will trigger even shame. Not just guilt. So, of course, you would then want to go back to conform to the public self that is being expected of you, that others impose on you.
Right? Follow your own beliefs and live in accordance with your beliefs. So this is where I started to feel a pretty profound sense of self and sense of, I guess, control of my own script, when I stopped believing in the fact that I had to adhere to other scripts. And if I did not adhere to another script, then there was some negative product of that, because again, this is a classic programming tool. So I had to really wrap my head around, I am me, this is the way that I'm going to do it, this is the way that I'm going to be, and I am absolutely not going to feel any guilt because I have chosen my direction, my script, my reality. And if somebody does not believe in the way that I'm doing things, I really don't care anymore. This is about me, this is about my life, and I see very, very clearly now when somebody is trying to use guilt to manipulate me. It is about you reshaping your external script to the extent that you do not allow someone else's opinion to convince you that it's not right for whatever reason. Now, in my opinion, guilt is projected outward when someone is not adhering to someone else's script.
So this is a checklist on cult characteristics. The leadership dictates, sometimes in great detail, how members should think, act, and feel, which is called brainwashing. Reprogramming you, which removes you just the same from your inner core true self. Group is elitist, claiming a special exalted status for itself. The group has polarized us versus them mentality, which causes conflict with the wider society. The group's leader is not accountable to any authorities. The leadership induces guilt feelings in members in order to control them. Members' subservience to the group causes them to cut ties with family and friends and to give up personal goals and activities that were of interest before joining the group. Recognizing and coping with experience of coercive control in religious cultic groups. Research on victimization in cultic groups defines with precision the process of control that can be experienced within cultic groups. Bounded choice, or mind control. The Byte model by Hassan. Stephen Hassan's Byte model of authoritarian control. This is the website. Dissertation published on January 2021, the BITE model of authoritarian control, undue influence, thought reform, brainwashing, mind control, trafficking, and the law. Many people think of mind control as an ambiguous, mystical process that cannot be defined in concrete terms. In reality, mind control refers to a specific set of methods and techniques, such as hypnosis or thought stopping, that influence how a person thinks, feels, and acts. So the emotional control mainly is what's the most debilitating, and it can happen online just the same. Manipulate and narrow the range of feelings. Some emotions and or needs are deemed as evil, wrong, or selfish. Teach emotion stopping techniques to block feelings of homesickness, anger, doubt. Make the person feel that problems are always their own fault, never the leader's or the group's fault. Promote feelings of guilt or unworthiness, such as identity guilt, you are not living up to your potential, your thoughts, feelings, actions are irrelevant or selfish, social guilt, historical guilt. Instill fear, such as fear of thinking independently, the outside world, enemies, losing one's salvation, leaving or being shunned by the group, others' disapproval, extremes of emotional highs and lows, love bombing and praise, one moment and then declaring you are a horrible sinner, or some minor versions of that. Ritualistic and sometimes public confession of sins within an online group. This can be done by publicly sharing whatever you are going through. Phobia indoctrination, inculcating irrational fears about leaving the group or questioning the leader's authority. No happiness or fulfillment possible outside of the group. Terrible consequences if you leave, hell, demon possession, incurable diseases, accidents, suicide, insanity, blah blah. Shunning of those who leave. You become a non-person. Fear of being rejected by friends and family. Never a legitimate reason to leave. Those who leave are weak, undisciplined, unspiritual, worldly, brainwashed by family or counselor, or seduced by money, sex, or rock and roll. Well, that's an old one. That's outdated. Threats of harm to ex-member and family. Destructive mind control can be determined when the overall effect of these four components promotes dependency and obedience to some leader or cause. It is not necessary for every single item on the list to be present. Like many techniques, it is not inherently good or evil. If mind control techniques are used to empower an individual to have more choice and authority for their life remains within themselves, the effects can be beneficial. Mind control becomes destructive when it undermines a person's ability to think and act independently. It's a very good model, look that up. Some researchers document forms of abuse within the group such as neglect, abandonment, isolation, emotional and social deprivation, and sexual abuse. This, of course, is not the case in online groups. Other research identifies consequences experienced by former members after they quit occultic groups, such as psychological distress, difficulties to construct or reconstruct their identity. Yeah, you have to basically peel it off like an onion to find the real core beneath it, that is you. All of the other stuff is just a construct you have taken on while being in a cult. Difficulties to find a job and to thrive financially. Fear of being judged. Even a sense of guilt about behaviors they had within the group, but research rarely analyzed the process by which a person's names and recognizes abusive experiences.
Chapter 2. Pendulums. Rent yourself out. Destructive pendulums. We are taught from childhood to obey the will of others, to perform our duties, serve our country, our family, the company we work for, a political party, the state, or even an idea. To serve anyone except ourselves. To varying degrees, everyone has a sense of duty, responsibility, necessity, and guilt. Everyone is ready to serve a group or organization in one way or another, be it family, a club, school, company, political party, the state, and so on. All these structures emerge and develop when a separate group of people begin to think and act in the same way. Then they are joined by others and the structure grows, gaining strength, forcing its members to follow the rules and eventually amassing the potential to gain control over large groups of society. On the material level, the structure consists of a group of people united by common goals and material objects such as buildings, furniture, equipment, machinery, technology, and so on. On an energetic level, however, a structure appears when a group of people think in the same way, as a result of which the parameters of their thought energy are identical. Their thought energy finally unites into a single current. When this happens, as if in the middle of an entire ocean of energy, a separate, independent energy information structure is created, which is referred to as an energy pendulum. Eventually, the structure begins to live its own life and subjugate to its laws the very people who created it. The structure is referred to as a pendulum because the more people, adherents, that feed it with their energy, the more powerfully it sways. Every pendulum has its own characteristic beat frequency. For example, if you want to get a swing moving, you have to push it to a certain rhythm or frequency. This is called the resonant frequency. If the numbers of adherents decreases, the force of its swing is weakened. If it loses all its adherents, the pendulum will stop moving completely and thereby cease to exist as a separate entity.
What you find very often in those spiritual cults, that weird positivity, unrealistic optimism, and whenever you point out something that you noticed that doesn't add up, they completely dismiss it, they compartmentalize it, and find excuses saying that it is you who cannot see the truth, blaming it all on you, just completely refusing to face up to things that do not fit their narrative. And they have this unhealthy optimism about things. It's quite easy to spot, actually. Just feels weird. And not balanced. It's over-the-top optimism.
Some sort of deficit in the left frontal lobe. The left frontal lobe seems to have an emotional timbre of elation, irritability, and no surprise, it's in overdrive when people are manic.
And it tends to be optimistic.
Absurdly optimistic about things they can't be optimistic about, yes. So a completely unreal optimism is also a feature of people who have right hemisphere deficits. That's one of the reasons that it's harder to rehabilitate them.
To have a better idea of what is constructive or destructive, you can look up the influence continuum. So, constructive is authentic self, unconditional love, compassion, conscience, creativity and humor, free will, critical thinking. Destructive, false cold identity, conditional love, hate, doctrine, solemnity, fear and guilt, dependency and obedience. Constructive for leaders. They are psychologically healthy, they know their own limits, they empower individuals, they are trustworthy and accountable. That's a very important one. The destructive leader is narcissistic, psychopathic, elitist, grandiose, power-hungry, secretive, deceptive, claims absolute authority. For the organization, constructive is egalitarianism, checks and balances, informed consent, individuality, diversity, means create end, encourages growth, free to live. And destructive organizations are elitist, authoritarian structures, deceptive, manipulative, clones people, ends justify means, preserves own power.
I'm not the meek and obedient type. I don't have to do what you tell me to.
I better speak words fit to make a sailor blush.
Oh, go to hell. Fuck the kid. I've been beaten and I've been betrayed. I survived. The woman I am now is not the woman I once was. So time, space, history, damned.
So, dare to be the outlander. Educate yourself about such programming schemes. See through all these manipulations and laugh them away. Connect to your true self. It will guide you. It will show you the truth. Trust your true self.
They are indeed extraordinary people. However, there is an even more incredible story about the Australian Aborigine, and that is the deep profundity of their understanding of reality and the cosmos. It is commonly agreed among anthropologists that for most indigenous peoples of this earth, their day-to-day survival needs were met with approximately 3 to 4 hours a day of hunting and gathering, and the Australian Aborigines were no different. It is estimated that it took between 3 to 4 hours a day of hunting by the men and gathering by the women to meet all the tribe's needs for that day. So what did they do with the other 20 hours of the day? The great Swiss psychologist and student and colleague of Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, was obsessed with the Australian Aborigine. Jung also estimated that the Australian Aborigines spent 3 to 4 hours a day meeting their survival needs. But where Jung felt that the Australian Aborigines were unique among the world's indigenous people was how they utilized the overwhelming majority of their time. According to Jung, they spent that time almost exclusively cultivating a higher state of consciousness. Or in Jungian terms, they spend the vast majority of their time contacting and immersing themselves in the collective unconscious. Now, it is not unusual for the Earth's indigenous people to endeavor to raise their consciousness or to make contact with so-called spiritual realms. However, the Australian Aborigines used every spare moment for consciousness raising. Yun, among others, estimated that they spent 3/4 of their lives doing this. Unlike the New Zealand Maori, the Australian Aborigine did not use any psychoactive plants to assist them. Instead, the way in which they cultivated a higher consciousness was exclusively through the practice of art. Story, music, song, dance, and painting were the methods that Australian Aborigines used. All of these were practiced and performed so that they might more deeply dwell in what they knew as the dreaming. The now moment, beyond the historical, always now, only apparently then, the moment before the existence of time, when nothing became something. The Australian Aborigines' dreaming is primarily a creation myth, where nothing produced something.
And dream the real you back into reality. Remember that the only God man comes in contact with is his own God, called spirit, soul, and mind, or consciousness, and these three are one. Happy winter solstice.